Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jill Marriage. I am a graduate student in Museum Curatorial Studies at Cal State Long Beach and the lead organizer of Forms of Reparations, Museum and Restorative Justice. This is a virtual symposium that aims to identify the ways in which cultural institutions sustain white supremacy, imperialism, and exploitation. First, Jacob Shoto, a PFA student in 3D arts and woodworking at Cal State Long Beach, will give an acknowledgement.
CSULB is located on the sacred site of Puvungna. We acknowledge that we are on the land of the Tongva Gabrieleño and the Hachman Honeño nations, who have lived and continue to live here. We recognize the Tongva Hachman nations and their spiritual connection as the first stewards and the traditional caretakers of this land. We thank them for their strength, perseverance, and resistance.
Thank you, Jacob. The event was conceptualized by the School of Art Concerned Students of Colors and Allies in 2018 and then passed to us, making it a truly collective effort within the School of Art. We would like to acknowledge our advisors, Nizan and Julian Myers-Szupinska, as well as our funding sources, CSULB School of Art, Instructionally Related Activities Grant Allocation, Associated Students Incorporated, and the Beall Center for Art and Technology at the University of California, Irvine. In this virtual format, we ask that attendees submit questions for the monitored Q&A portion of this session through the Q&A function on both the Zoom webinar as well as the YouTube live stream. This will allow us to ask on your behalf and comply with our university's regulations about recording people's faces and voices. It is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Alma Ruiz. Alma Ruiz is a senior fellow with the Center for Business and Management of the Arts at Claremont Graduate University here in California. She is a former senior curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and having left in 2015 after 31 years at the museum. Ruiz's curatorial work has focused on exhibitions of post-war artists with an emphasis on emerging and Latin American artists. Two of her most notable exhibitions at MoCA, The Experimental Exercise of Freedom and Supersensorial Experiments in Light, Color, and Space, rewrote the recent history of contemporary installation art to include a Latin American perspective. Since 2015, Ruiz has worked as an independent curator on projects such as the 2016 Bienal de Artes in Guatemala City, and she's currently working on an exhibition of Guatemalan artist Diana de Solares for the Craft Contemporary. Welcome and thank you for being here today.
Alma, your microphone is muted.
Okay.
And let me just, I'm sorry to interrupt the process, but let me just take the opportunity to say something is wrong with our Zoom webinar code. I'm getting emails from students. So I think we should just stay right here. And Alma, I'll just let you know that all your audience is on YouTube. And so we'll be funneling in the questions from there and otherwise continuing as usual, unless Jill tells us otherwise, right, Jill?
Yep, on the back end, I'm going to go ahead and figure that out for everybody right now.
Okay, thank you.
But otherwise, we're fine, right?
Yeah, we're totally fine. Everyone is just simply watching us through YouTube right now.
Okay. Oh, I see. I understand that. Okay, that's fine. So let me see if I can find my text. I had it here, but we've been working on it, on certain things, and I wasn't able to get it. So, okay, here we go. So, first of all, I want to thank Jill and Nizan, and of course, California State University, Long Beach, for inviting me to participate in the symposium. I also understand that from the initial invitation that I received at the beginning of the year, that some students in Nizan's Curatorial Studies class had proposed my name as someone who perhaps has something to say on the subject that we're discussing in this webinar. So I want to say to the students that I really appreciate it and that I hope that I will not disappoint you. But my talk today, you know, it's about the potential of Los Angeles art museums, and my focus is on MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art, where I worked for so many years. So I will be focusing on my career at MoCA from the beginning, which was not as a curator, but eventually, and also the opportunities that I had that led me to become one. I have been working together with a small group of people on a book about the Museum of Contemporary Art for most of this year. So, you know, from the beginning in January to now, that's been one of my main projects. Researching and documenting the museum's first 20 years from 1979 to 2000 offered me a renewed appreciation for the civic leaders, the private citizens, and the artists who believed that Los Angeles deserved a Museum of Contemporary Art, and also for the staff who worked so hard to make it a reality. So accomplishing this task through the pandemic was challenging. I had no access to the MoCA archives or to specialized libraries, but I was able to gather enough information by consulting. Luckily, I found the private archives of a MoCA founding trustee who was willing to give them to me so I could keep that material at home. And also, I was able to read numerous transcripts of interviews we conducted over the last 2 years with architects, artists, former trustees and staff, and other creatives who in one way or another were connected to MoCA during those formative early years. I was also able to consult my own library of MoCA exhibition catalogs. That was one of the best things that happened to me, because I could just only walk to, you know, another room and find the books and be able to look at them, read them, and extract the information that I needed for that. And of course, I pored over countless articles from the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. I tried to leave people's memories out, as they tended to fade with time. So this is something that I found out, that some people's recollections were not as accurate. But the documentation that I gathered from all these different sources helped me put together an extended chronology that will be part of this book. So despite the limitations caused by the pandemic, I was able to complete the chronology. The book is being edited at the moment and will be published in the spring of 2021. Now, that book is not going to be available for sale. So you're not going to find it in bookstores, or you're not going to find it in Amazon. It's going to be given out for free. And we're going to make sure that universities and museum libraries get a copy. So we hope that people will enjoy that book. About MoCA, there has been no books written so far, so this is the first one, but we hope it's not the last one. So again, my presentation today is based on my experience as a curator at MoCA for roughly 3 decades. After completing an MA at Middlebury College and the University of Florence, I stayed on in Italy a bit longer than planned to work as an assistant to the director of Middlebury College's Italian school, who was an elegant Florentine woman and also a professor of Renaissance art. Knowing after a while, you know, I had a feeling I had completed my abroad experience, I returned to Los Angeles after a 3-year absence in 1983. And in February of 1984, I entered the museum world by taking the administrative assistant position to the director at the newly opened Museum of Contemporary Art. So that was my initial entry into MoCA. My path to the curatorial profession was not a straight line. Having begun in the museum's administrative side, I transferred to the curatorial department at the end of 1986, a move that coincided with the arrival of Mary Jane Jacob, MoCA's second senior curator. As a traveling exhibition coordinator, I began to organize national and international tours of MoCA exhibitions. Richard Koszalek, the director at the time, had assembled a list of 25 museums he wanted to collaborate with. He did not set a deadline to accomplish that task, but by 1999, the year he left to become president of Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, MoCA had traveled exhibitions to all but one of those museums. A few years later, in 2007, the Robert Rauschenberg Combine show was seen at the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris. So that was quite an accomplishment. We had a very active traveling exhibitions program that actually gave the museum, that made the museum in a way well known in Europe, the US, but also Japan and Latin America. So coordinating the traveling exhibitions program taught me a lot, from drafting the first touring exhibition contract to managing multiple tours when we had several exhibitions on the road, to forming professional relationships across the US and abroad, and most importantly, to working closely with the MoCA curators. So my proximity to them introduced me to the curatorial process. And I began to harbor the idea that perhaps one day I could curate too. My experience abroad, plus an undergraduate degree in art history, along with the on-the-job training I was gaining every day, were invaluable and put me on solid ground for what was yet to come. So by 1995, MoCA had been around for about a decade. It was widely known with an excellent reputation in the museum world. In fact, I think MoCA was better known outside of Los Angeles at the time, and we used to talk about that. The focus of its programming was mostly European and American art. However, from the beginning, MoCA had paid attention to local artists. For example, Betty Saar's solo exhibition, Selected Assemblages, was held at the Temporary Contemporary, now the MoCA Geffen, in 1984. And Gronk and Willie Heron were two of the 9 artists featured in summer 1985 9 Artists. And of course, there were other artists as well. Founded as an international museum, MoCA knew it needed to expand its borders beyond the European American axis. After a period of internal discussions with the staff and then the board, the museum established the Latin American Art Research and Exhibition Program to incorporate artists from the neighboring countries. Koszalek strongly felt that MoCA was the right place for this due to its location in a city with Spanish and Mexican roots. He also believed firmly that a curator with knowledge of the culture and the language should lead it. So I was very excited when that responsibility fell on me. At the time of this appointment, I was already dividing my time between coordinating exhibitions and curating. As I assumed this new commitment, I continued to split my time between these two until 2000, when the museum was able to hire a new exhibitions coordinator. So it took a while, but I got there. The Latin American Art Research and Exhibition Program was never a standalone initiative. It always functioned within the curatorial department under the chief curator's supervision, and it continued as such until I left the museum in 2015. For 20 years, MoCA made good on its commitment. I organized 8 one-person shows, 3 group exhibitions, and 1 website project, and published 8 catalogs. This in addition to curating exhibitions by non-Latin American artists. Latin American artists were also included in other exhibitions, especially large historical shows such as Hall of Mirrors, Art and Film since 1945, WAC and the Feminist Revolution, Out of Actions Between Performance and the Object, 1949-1979, and at the end of the century, 100 Years of Architecture. During my time at MoCA, curatorial discussions focused mainly on artists and their work through a formal lens. Conversations about race, racism, social justice, colonial theory were not had. Our preoccupations center more around the inclusion of women artists. It was interesting, male artists and women artists. We were talking about that a lot all the time. 2 events preceding the official opening of MoCA in the fall of 1983 were by women. The first, Available Light, showcased the work of New York choreographer Lucinda Childs in collaboration with the architect Frank Gehry and the photographer Gary Winogrand. The second, a commissioned installation by Maria Norman, a Dutch-born Los Angeles-based artist, was presented in a downtown building near the temporary Contemporary. That was an interesting installation because not a lot of people saw it. It was titled Yang Na, which referred to the early inhabitants along the Los Angeles River. And she created this installation by flooding an abandoned building. Well, it wasn't abandoned, a vacant building that was actually scheduled to be demolished. It belonged to the city. And when she approached the city for permission to do the installation, the city could only do it for one day. So anyone who didn't see the exhibition that day, and with the artist not wanting to photograph it, doesn't even know it happened. But there is at least one article written by Melinda Wirtz, who in a way is the only one that I have found that sort of explains the project, because even MoCA does not have documentation on that particular work, that particular installation. So since then, you know, the museum has celebrated women artists in one-person shows, retrospectives, artist projects, performances, and historical exhibitions. Now, returning to the subject of Latin American art curating, institutional support during an arc of 20 years and 4 different directors was not perfect. It was a mixed bag at best, especially during the last few years. Early on, Koshalik was very much in support, while Paul Schimmel, the chief curator, was not an immediate convert. From 1996 to 2000, I created 5 exhibitions. So Jill, if you could please put the PowerPoint on. Great. Okay, so the exhibition that inaugurated this program was the one that you're seeing on your screen right now by the Brazilian artist Rosângela Renault, and it was called Secretaries. And the artist actually was very much influenced by photojournalism and documentary photography, and she worked with found photography. So what you see here are images that she found in a prison in Sao Paulo. And these are prisoners with tattoos in their bodies. Apparently one of the doctors there began an archive documenting the tattoos in the prisoners' bodies. And she found this abandoned archive and got permission from the prison to use it. The photographs were accompanied by text in Portuguese, Spanish, and English from what she called her Universal Archive. And these were stories about photography. So every text that you read had something to do with photography, a photographer, a photograph, and so on. It was quite a beautiful installation. And MoCA did acquire part of that installation, so it is in the MoCA collection. The second one, the next slide, please. Was by a Cuban artist, Cacho, whose real name is Alexis Leiva Machado. And actually, Paul Schimmel met Cacho at the Gwangju Biennial, where Paul was one of the curators who awarded him the grand prize in 1995. So coming back from Gwangju, Paul and I talked about the work by this artist, and then we decided that we wanted to co-curate an exhibition of his work, and this is the exhibition itself. I actually did most of the work on the exhibition and the catalog because of the language. Cacho does not speak English, and Paul doesn't speak Spanish, so the communication between them wasn't as fluid. And so, but it worked out really well. Cacho made this installation in Havana. Then we shipped it to Los Angeles. And it was done at a time of intense migration from the island to the United States. So this is what this installation is about. It consisted of kind of a series of bookshelves and books in the form of a boat, like a floating library, and a series of sculptures on the theme of the boat and other other objects that Cubans were trying to convert into boats so they could leave the island. So it was a beautiful installation. We were a little concerned about protests in Los Angeles because a bunch of people had protested Cacho's exhibition at Barbara Gladstone in New York, especially, anti-Castro groups. But in Los Angeles, didn't happen, although we had prepared for that. But in any case, it just went well, and this exhibition does carry a publication. So the next slide, please. This is you can see here the boat. The United States government gave Cacho a visa to come to the museum about a year before the exhibition took place, and he was able to select the galleries he wanted for the installation. But by the time we had to install the show, he was denied a visa. And so instead of that, what he did is that he made a Xerox copy of all the documentation he had provided the US, including the MoCA letter of invitation. And he asked me to make a copy. He faxed it, asked me to make a copy and to place it in the in this installation in case, someone wanted to read it and know the reason why he wasn't present. So anyway, so that was sad. He wasn't here, but the exhibition went on anyway. The next slide. So I was working on these exhibitions about one a year. So Ana Mendieta took place the year after in 1998. And it was based on a portfolio we had acquired with a grant from the Judith Rothschild Foundation. We had gotten this grant and I had applied for it after lengthy discussions with Paul, who for some reason initially had, when I had requested acquisition funds from one of the museum funds, he had said no. So luckily by chance, I found this grant and I felt that we could apply for it. But again, trying to convince Paul took a while. But he came around and we applied and we acquired the portfolio. And as a condition of the grant, we were supposed to do an exhibition within 2 years. So we showed a selection of the photographs, which were actually, here we see Mendieta using her body in a series of performative outdoor sculptural installations that she made, I think in Iowa and also in Mexico between 1973 and 1977. So I complemented that with some of the figures that she had carved on the walls of the Park of Jaruco in Havana, and also a series of videos that she had done early on and that were obtainable, because she did a lot of film, but not all of it has been seen even today. So the next slide, please. So after a succession of 3 artist solo exhibitions or projects, I invited a curator, a Venezuelan curator, to work with me on a group exhibition, which we titled The Experimental Exercise of Freedom. That was taken from some writings by a Brazilian critic, Mario Pedrosa, who had used that expression to actually discuss the work of Elio Oiticica. And we included Elio Oiticica in the work. What you see here is actually the replica of Matias Gerritz's studio in Mexico. Matias Gerritz was an architect and art historian who settled in Mexico in the early 1950s. And he experimented a lot with what he called emotional architecture, building towers inside the studio. And so we wanted to do that at the Geffen. The next slide, please. The other 2 artists we also showed were Gego, whose real name was Gertrude Goldsmith. She had settled in Venezuela, and Mira Schendel, who was Swiss and had settled in Brazil because of World War II. They were Jewish, and they were, even though they lived at different times, they both ended up in South America. And Gego was well known for her wire constructions. She was an architect and an engineer in Germany. and had carried that knowledge, which she then applied to her art. And Mira Schendel, as you can see from here, was, she actually was an interesting art individual in the sense that she was very much into theology. Most of her discussions were with theologians and philosophers instead of artists. But she ended up starting with painting early on in her career, and then moving into these constructions made out of Japanese paper, which she called droguinhas, and which in Portuguese mean nothings, and she would hang them or sort of place them on the floor so you would unexpectedly run into them. And then the next slide, please. And here we have Leja Clarke, who I'm just showing you a couple of examples of her work. These are the biological architectures, which she used to sort of encourage people to be get to be in touch with their own bodies, and to work collectively. And here you see two people under this plastic construction. We had to have educators sort of encourage patrons to, interact with the artwork, to participate. Otherwise, it would make nothing for them to just look at these objects sitting, being placed down on a mat. So we worked a lot with the education department to make sure that we could have a very, what we call the participatory experience, in which the work did not come to life unless our patrons, our visitors interacted with them. And the next one, please. We were also able to recreate this installation by Leja Clarke called The House is the Body. And it was the second time actually that was recreated. The first time was in 1968, and it was shown in the Venice Biennale. But we were able to reconstruct it according to the plans that were forwarded to us by the Clarke Foundation. And it was quite amazing. It basically imitates the female reproduction system. And you enter on the left and you exit on the right, and the center is the uterus, and you can sit there, and it's beautiful and it's warm and it's comfortable, just the way I assume the uterus is. I don't have any memories of that, but it was so interesting to have people go and sit there for a while, because getting to that point was a little difficult. There were a lot of obstacles that you had to overcome to get into that center space, and then of course more obstacles to get out, sort of imitating the difficulties of birth. So the next one, please. And of course, since we had looked at the work of Elio Itisica, and he was in a way one of the main figures, or the figure from which this idea sprung out, we included this installation called Eden Whitechapel Experience 1969, because Elio Itisica had created this installation for the Whitechapel in London. He had left Brazil, a little before. He went into exile because of the repressive government at the time. Many artists in Brazil between 65 and 69 left the country because they felt they couldn't work there because of governmental repression. And he went to London. Other artists came to the United States or went to France. And while in London, Guy Brett, the art critic and curator, invited him to do this, to do an exhibition at the Whitechapel. And he entitled this one, the Eden Whitechapel Experience. And you can see here some of the constructions that made this installation. It was quite huge. As you can see, there was a lot of sand on the floor. And the vertical boxes that you see people going in and out, these little rooms are called penetrables, and some of them had water, so you had to, of course, you didn't have your shoes, and you could step in the water, or you could step into dry leaves or maybe pebbles, and have all these kind of sensorial experiences. The next one, please. And here you can see one of the nests. This one was filled with foam, so it was very comfortable to lie down and read or sleep or chat. You know, these were kind of social spaces that Erensto Neto had created, as he felt that art had to connect to everyday life, and it didn't have to be in a museum. But of course, you know, this installation ended up in a museum, and but it was wonderful. People really loved it. There was a tent in which you could lie down and listen to music, and then, you know, many people came back over and over and over, and they spent a lot of time there. So I think that in that sense, what Oiticica had in mind of creating this social space was quite successful. So, these 5 exhibitions came in rapid succession, and I thought there was an auspicious beginning, and also one that would carry the momentum for another, I think, for another 15 years. So we began to introduce Latin American artists to Los Angeles. Galleries began to take notice. Collectors did as well. Art trustees were supportive. So in a way, we were getting funding for this show. So in a way, I think we felt we were doing the right thing. The next one, please. No, that's way, there are a few exhibitions before. Oh no, I'm sorry, you're right. You're right. No, that's fine. So after the experimental exercise of freedom, then I opened an exhibition of Gabriel Orozco, and this was about then the summer of 2000, and it was a 10-year an exhibition that covered 10 years of his career. He had a small show at MoMA a few years before, and he was better known in Europe than anywhere else. He hadn't had exhibitions in Mexico City, where he was from. So when we organized this exhibition, we felt that it was important to, we had discussions with Mexican museums, and 2 of them were willing to take the exhibition. So Gabriel and I organized this exhibition with those museums in mind. And so we invited some writers from Mexico to write for the catalog, writers from the US, and also we published the catalog in English and Spanish. It was the first bilingual catalog. The museum has only done 2 bilingual catalogs for 2 of my exhibitions, and this was one of them. So, you know, Gabriel Orozco, of course, now he's very well known. And as you know, he sort of takes his cues from ordinary, often urban settings, and from found or industrially fabricated materials that celebrate unexpected associations and conceptual links. He also is very interested in movement, and a lot of his work is round or of a spherical shape. So here we see, I think there's is there a slide before this one? Maybe not. No, go ahead, I'm sorry. Forward. This is oval pendulum, and this is ping pong table, and which was is an artwork that is in MoCA's collection. And here 4 people can play ping pong, and you know, it's really fun. So a lot of Gabriel's work at that time involved, again, public participation. So the next one, please. And this is a view of the 3rd gallery in the museum. It was open. It was the idea to have this kind of landscape of artworks. The car that you see there is called La Déesse, which in French translates as the goddess. And it's a work that he actually made in 1993. And what he did is that he cut the car in 3 parts, and he removed the center part and then collapsed the 2 sides and streamlined the car. And at this point, you know, the car was already in the collection of the French government, so we couldn't really allow patrons to sit in the car, but initially the intention was for someone to sit in and experience this kind of disorientation that happens when the scale of an object has been tampered with. And then he did the same thing with this elevator from 1994, but that you could certainly use. And then he also, in addition to doing these works, he had this very more intimate practice in which he made a lot of small objects that were handmade. and that were collected, through time. They became quite, there were a lot of them, so he began to include them in exhibitions. And for MoCA, we constructed this low basis, and we installed all these objects in the center of the room. And so there was a mix of, handmade objects that belonged to the artist and other objects that were already in collections. And here, if you see that skull, the black and white skull, that was already in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So next one, please. Okay, I think we're going to continue the next one. So a couple of years went by, and then we began another group of exhibitions. This is Erensto Neto. We commissioned the Brazilian artist who is best known for creating sensuous environments and tactile organic forms to create this installation for the museum collection. And we did show it at the Pacific Design Center space, which was by then was the third space that MoCA was using for exhibitions. The next one, please. While we were working on that, while we were working on the installation of that particular commission, Erensto, who early on used to even sew his own pieces, had requested a sewing machine, to have in the gallery, and because he needed to adjust some things for the MoCA piece. But spontaneously, he looked at the space and he decided to create this work. So basically, this work came into fruition in a matter of days while we were installing the other piece upstairs. And I don't have a title for that. I don't think there was ever a title. It was just a temporary installation, quite beautiful. That you had to traverse. There were many panels, and you had to go through all of them to then go up the stairs to the other installation. But it sort of speaks to the spontaneity of the artist, especially when they're beginning and they are not as busy working for many exhibitions all over the world. I don't think he would be capable of doing something like that now, because his installations are more complex, much more complex, and much larger in scale. So the next one, please. In the same space where you saw the Erensto Neto, a year later, we showcased the work of Carlos Garaycoa, another Cuban artist. At the time, Carlos was kind of focusing on Cuba's politics and ideologies through the examination of modern architecture. I think his obsession with architecture came from the fact that at the time, a lot of buildings in Cuba, were in Havana especially, were actually falling down. They were in such disrepair that as you walk through the city, you saw scaffoldings, you saw how facades were being propped up, and how some buildings had already collapsed. So there were a lot of empty lots in the city. And Carlos used to walk through the city, through the streets of Havana, and photograph these ruins or these empty lots, and began to work on designing buildings, and then creating buildings, photographing buildings, designing them, etc. This is a kind of a futuristic city, a floating city that he created around this time. And so we installed it downstairs in a room by itself. The next one, please. And here we have two views of the exhibition. The left is a chess game that he designed. It was called Casablanca's Real Passion. Casablanca was a chess master in Cuba, well known internationally in the chess world many years ago, I suppose. And Carlos wanted to sort of render homage to this person, as he also liked chess, and he created this chess game in which there were two players. One player had a set of they were buildings instead of the regular chess pieces, and one set was classical buildings. So some of the buildings were real and some were not. And then the opponent had a set of modern buildings, which were all, you know, from Carlos' imagination. And as you can see, the squares also are not all flush, but some are higher than others. And it sort of speaks about the city, you know, about topography, about geographical topography. And so he brought this piece. This was new to the show, and it's in a collection now, I believe, in Washington, D.C. The other one, the one on the right, sort of showed two utopian projects that he had made up, he had invented, and he called them the campus of, or the Babel of knowledge. In the front and in the back, it was called Continuity of Somebody's Architecture. And it was all about the panopticon and how people can be observed at all times, that all their movements are being observed and without them knowing actually. And so it you know, it was something that Cubans at the time and perhaps even today have to live with that. So the next one, please. Then immediately after, we collaborated with Red Cat on this exhibition called Damian Ortega, the Beall Trilogy. One of the reasons why Red Cat approached us is because we own this piece. Cosmic Thing was acquired by MoCA in 2003. And it was the first part of the Beall Trilogy, and it came to the museum. So we had an opportunity to show the piece during this collaboration. And the interesting thing about Damian is that he had been trained as a political cartoonist. So he used irony and humor to undermine preconceived notions about art. So a lot of his art has that kind of a funny side or comical side. And the rest of the exhibition was at Red Cat. During that time, he was already working on the second part of the trilogy and eventually the third part. And as we had acquired this Cosmic Thing in 2002, I felt it would be a good idea to acquire the other two so we could have the trilogy, the complete body of work. And but it didn't happen right away, even though the other two parts were done by 2005. It wasn't until 2012 that I was able to acquire them and bring them into the collection. So sometimes acquisitions take years, and if you stay in one place, you're able to do that. If you move, you go to another museum, then the opportunity is lost. But in any case, I am happy that the trilogy is at MoCA in the collection and hope that they will show it one day. Let's see, I think we have one more exhibition here that I wanted to show. There are a couple more, but the next one is Poetics of the, I wanted to show you that because I think that that's something that no one gets to see except the MoCA, the museum staff. And I think it's very interesting. This was the installation of Cosmic Thing, and it showed the artists working with the staff and the registrar in putting this piece together. And the first photograph is actually at the very beginning when you start opening the crates and taking all the objects out. The second one shows the artist putting the motor together. And then the third and the fourth, you know, they are hoisting the car, which is actually held by steel cables. And there is a grid above, which you don't see here, that will hold the entire piece together. So I thought it would be fun to show that. The next one, please. As I said before, you know, MoCA was always had always supported women artists, and we made a conscious effort to do that. And the first exhibition in the Latin American art program was a woman. Here for this exhibition, Poetics of the Handmaid, there were 8 artists and 3 of them were women. So I'm only going to show you images of the artists, the women artists' works. So we don't take too much time, but Magdalena Atria, the 3 artists were from Chile, which was interesting. I was thinking of doing an exhibition that had to do with the handmade, but I didn't want the traditional forms of handmade work, like embroidery, for example. So I looked for artists who had this kind of meticulous process-oriented approach, and they were using everyday materials, which they transformed into handcrafted works of art. So here she's using plasticine, you know, that's like that putty, like a putty material she would buy for her children. And that's how she found out that the best kind was Japanese, and she began to acquire and purchased lots of them and began to use it as an art material. So this is the line that runs along the wall. It's not held by anything. The plasticine sticks to the wall. It doesn't dry. If someone were to touch it, it was easy to sort of erase any marks. So it was quite a beautiful installation. And so she had another sculpture that we don't see here, but this was one of my favorite pieces in the show. The next one, please. The next one, again, was another Chilean artist, as I said, Monica Bengoa. And this is a mural that she created specifically for the show. The image is a photograph of her bookshelf. The upper shelf has books, I think these are all literature books from some of her favorite authors. And the bottom shelf has books on photography, which is another aspect of her work. And she basically had a group of women help her create this by hand. And it was basically drawn with color pencil on small squares of paper, which you can see if you look at it very carefully. So there were hundreds of paper squares that had to be glued or attached to that wall. And of course, the title is almost impossible. She takes it from this particular French writer, but it was quite beautiful because the paper was not totally attached to the wall. I think it was only attached on one side, and so it had a certain movement as well. And the third artist I want to show you is the next slide. It's Livia Marin. Who had made this beautiful installation a couple of years before. It's kind of a combination of minimalism and feminism, you know, in a way, done in a very beautiful way. She actually handcrafted over 2,000 lipsticks and in all these various kind of sculptural forms. And they were just sitting right on top of that base. So one of our preoccupations was, will someone touch them and they will fall off the edge of the base? Or will someone just take them because they were quite attractive, and also they smelled. So when the exhibition opened, the smell was quite noticeable, you know, and as time went on, it was less. But it was quite a beautiful sensorial work as well, which reminded me a lot of Elio Itizica, and of course many Latin American artists work this way as they like this kind of idea of this relationship between the body and the artwork. There's always this idea of sort of making that space between the art and the body disappear, making the viewer an active participant, you know, kind of in a way, the idea is to make art more democratic. You know, art doesn't have to be on a pedestal, art doesn't have to be in a museum, art doesn't have to be precious. And in a way, many of them try to subvert the market by creating work that at that time was not collectible. But in, you know, as it happens, almost anything that's not collectible with time becomes collectible, and many of those works entered private collections or museum collections as well. But in terms of Livia, this installation is actually belongs to a foundation in Santiago, Chile. So the next, let's see. So, you know, at this point, we had a new director. Jeremy Strick was the director, and it was as hard as it was to get a reading on his interest in Latin American art. I think Paul's leadership at the time, along with the generous fund from Eugenio Lopez, a Mexican collector and businessman with home in Los Angeles and Mexico, allowed the program to thrive, and it extended its longevity. So, so it was hard for me to know if Jeremy was really interested. You know, he was not. I mean, he allowed these exhibitions to happen, but I never really heard anything from him specifically about them. But I was happy that they were happening. So despite the difficulties arising of or the resistance to some of the projects, I remained at MoCA fully aware also, and this is really important, that were I to leave the museum, the chances of being replaced by someone like me were very small. And this is something that many of us who work with certain kind of artists or certain kind of work have to be aware of, that we are there, we're in the institution, we're working, but if we leave, there is no assurance that the person who comes after us, who takes that position, will do the same kind of work, or will have the same kind of interest, or will support the same kind of art. So I that's one of the reasons why I felt, well, we're working, we have the support of the board, we have the support of collectors. Our audiences like the exhibitions. Will continue to curate artists from Latin America into the exhibition program for as long as it takes. So by the time, Jeffrey Deitch succeeded Strick. Jeffrey was our third director, and he came in 2010. MoCA was having a lot of problems, and directors were not lasting very long. But by the time he succeeded Strick, Suprasensorial Experiments in Light, Color, and Space was ready for a November 2010 opening. So we can go to that slide. There may be a blank slide in between. So the next one, here we go. So, one of the advantages in working in an institution, in staying put for a long time, was that I was able to build up on the exhibitions, taking ideas from exhibitions I had done in the past to make new exhibitions. And I think that, again, because we had done the experimental exercise of freedom in 1999, and Oiticica was such a central figure, I thought about the light and space, California artists from the light and space movement, which the museum had shown. We had done a large exhibition of Robert Irwin. We had also shown James Turrell early on, I think it was 1985. Doug Wheeler, we had a piece by Doug Wheeler in the collection as well. And so we had worked with all these artists from the light and space movement in California. And I started to think, well, there are artists in Latin America who were working with light, color, and space way before, in the 1960s and 70s. So let's do an exhibition of that. And again, taking Oiticica as the starting of the exhibition, I put together this show, which was very small. It consisted of 5 installations, but large installations at the Geffen. And I created this beautiful, if I may say so, I still think it's quite beautiful, exhibition that, again, gave our patrons an opportunity to be active participants. And so this is a general view of the installation. You can see some women in bathing suits, and you may be wondering why they are wearing bathing suits in the museum, but you will see soon the reason why. The next slide, please. Here we have 2 of the installations. One is by Julio Leparc, Lumière and Mouvement d'Installation. Julio Leparc was from Argentina. Many of these artists had settled in Europe, actually. Julio Leparc had gone to France and still lives in Paris. He was a student of Fontana when Lucio Fontana lived in Argentina in the 1940s. He had gone back to Argentina. He was born there and had gone back to Argentina during World War II and was teaching at one of the local art schools. So Julio Leparc was a young art student, and he studied under Fontana. And it was the time in which Fontana was conducting a lot of experiments with light, trying to make art with light. And this is something that Julio took on and continued as an artist for many, many years. And then the one below that is by Carlos Cruz Diez, and is an installation that is done with color lights. green, red, and blue color lights, and it's kind of a meditative space. You really have to stay there and wait for your senses to adjust to this kind of light. This installation actually is in the MoCA collection. We acquired it in collaboration with the Hirshhorn Museum. So the artist gave us separate instructions and we both own the piece. It's in both collections. And this is something that many museums have done. MoCA has about 5 pieces that were acquired in partnership with other institutions like the Art Institute of Chicago, for example, because sometimes the works are so expensive that you can't invest that kind of money on one piece. So by acquiring it with another museum, then you only pay a portion of the price and you still own the work. So that sometimes helps, but here the interest was that the Hirshhorn owns a collection of works by Latin American artists who dealt with the same ideas. And so they wanted to have a Carlos Christier's chromosaturation in their collection to complement what they already had. So the next one, please. And here is the reason why some people were wearing bathing suits. You could actually come and swim in the museum. And doing this in the temporary contemporary, now the MoCA Geffen, was great because there were no other exhibitions at the time. So we didn't have to worry about humidity. We didn't have to worry about conservation issues. And we were able to build this swimming pool according to Oiticica's plan. He was part of a series of works called Cosmococa, Programa in Progress, and that he had done in collaboration with other artists, art critics, friends, and that was the idea, to collaborate with different people. He had thought about doing about 9, but didn't get to do them, and many of them existed only on paper. And this installation was actually recreated, I think once before, for a biennial in Sao Paulo. And then we did it at MoCA in 1999. And then after that, it's been acquired by a Brazilian collector. And it's been shown also in Europe as well, I think a couple of times. So, but it was an interesting installation to have in the museum. You could actually enter the art in such a different way. And, it was an homage to John Cage. If you see the projection, it was actually notations by John Cage, but it also was at a time in which cocaine was quite preponderant in New York, especially in the 70s when Oiticica spent a couple of years there. And the projection also, if you see those kind of objects on top of the Cage book, are actually cocaine paraphernalia that was being sold at Tiffany's. Tiffany sold them in silver. So anyways, it was quite of an interesting thing. I don't know how many people paid attention to that part of the installation, but they certainly used the swimming pool. We had a lifeguard, according to the laws of California, we couldn't have a swimming pool without a lifeguard. And we had a lot of people who came, mothers with babies came, they had play dates there. Kids celebrated their birthday in the pool. Other people came regularly to swim in the afternoon. It was a very interesting to see the interest. You could bring your own bathing suit or you could buy one in the bookstore, and we provided dressing rooms and towels and a locker, so you could you could put your stuff away without being concerned about it. So it's interesting how artists like Oiticica always thought about works in terms of being fun, of works that had profound meaning, but at the same time were very playful, were works that were easily understood if you didn't want to really delve into the deeper meaning of it. And they could be enjoyed always in a kind of a communal way. The socializing, being social, being with other people was really important to him. So this after this exhibition in 2010, 2010, the museum was going through a lot of issues, and Paul Schimmel left in 2012, taking his support of the program with him. And Deitch followed a year later. So all these changes brought with them the uncertainty of where the museum was headed, you know, and without a director and a chief curator, we could not add exhibitions to the schedule. So the firm grip that Deitch had on the program had also left us with a quasi-empty calendar. And so we were asked, the curators were asked to come up with ideas for shows rather quickly. At that time, I reached out to Tomás Saraceno, the Argentinian artist, whose career I had followed for several years. But although he was flattered by the invitation, he declined because he was very busy. So eventually we were able to fill all the empty slots, but not without much apprehension. You know, we were working really fast. The press and the public didn't know what was going on, and we were trying to do things in a way that it didn't show that to the public, right? So while still at MoCA, Deitch greenlighted a solo exhibition of Venezuelan artist Magdalena Fernandez. You know, it was really hard to get anything on the schedule with him, but somehow, you know, he said yes to this one exhibition. So by then, you know, several years had gone without an exhibition of Latin American art, but I was working on other exhibitions, so I was busy all the time. So when the new director, Philippe Verne, arrived in 2014, he seemed enthusiastic about the artist. And so I traveled one last time to Caracas to meet with Magdalena and with several collectors to request, you know, preliminary loan requests, to tell them about the exhibition, to ask them if they would lend their work. And I got a good response from them. But 8 months later, a new chief curator arrived. And without ever discussing the exhibition with me, she informed me that Magdalena Fernandez was no longer a mid-career survey. And if I still cared for it, it could take the form of a smaller show at the Pacific Design Center, and also that there would be no catalog. So that was the big surprise. So can we show the last slide, please? So here we have Magdalena Fernandez. The installation at the top is an installation that I was going to initially show in the larger show. As that was no longer possible, then I, before the chief curator came, I actually presented it for acquisition to the acquisition committee, and they were fine with it, and this installation entered the museum collection. So it is at MoCA. It was shown at MoLA in Long Beach before the museum acquired it. So I think that's the only time that it's been shown in Southern California. But it's an edition of 3, and one of them is owned by the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. I think one is owned by MoCA, and I think that the third one is owned by a private collector. And the bottom slide here, you can see the installation at the Pacific Design Center, which, you know, it's hard to go through the process, but once I was notified that this exhibition wasn't going to happen as it had originally been designed. So I had to communicate these new circumstances to the artist, you know, which that was the most challenging part, you know, having to talk to the artists about it, because artists have expectations. And then I went on to thank the collectors for the loans and the catalog writers for their contributions. And I asked the artists to reconceptualize the show with me. And we centered it around several video installations and a new site-specific project. And in the end, you know, it wasn't the exhibition we had envisioned, but we still got a beautiful smaller show. And we did it too at the Pacific Design Center, and this was the first gallery when you enter the museum. There is a video on the other side of the wall with the red circle, but that you cannot see here, but this was the gallery. The work to the left is, the interesting thing about her is that she works with the language of geometric abstraction. playing with ideas of light, movement, and sound. So this also connects her to, you know, some of the artists that I had curated before. And you know, she was very interested in established abstract and kinetic art traditions since the 1950s, both in Europe and Latin America. So it was an interesting way to end, let's say, my tenure at MoCA with a woman artist, with someone who connected very directly to some of the artists I had shown before. And in the end, you know, I left in March of 2015 and came back at the end of the year to work on the installation and the exhibition. But it was a difficult time, also because the museum had changed its mind on the lyrical abstraction exhibition I was creating for PST LA. So Philippe asked me that I quickly develop a new exhibition concept. You know, I had been working years on this one show, and then he wanted an exhibition concept in a matter of weeks, which I did, but he and the chief curator turned it down. So that didn't happen either. So I then knew that it was time to move on, you know, and I did, coming back, as I said, later for the installation of the Fernandez show. So while the interest in Latin American artists lasted, it was really exciting. It showed MoCA's willingness to be open to new challenges, you know, but with a new administration, changes were expected, and soon MoCA pivoted in a new direction. So I consider myself a pragmatist, you know, and so, and also as someone who grew up outside the United States, you know, I was not attuned to issues of race, racism, and discrimination in the same way that perhaps someone born and growing up in this country would be. I tended to pay attention to other things, focused on getting an education and developing a profession, and perhaps close my eyes to situations that could affect me in a negative way. I did not want to, quote, waste my time, you know, by being distracted from what I wanted to do. For example, many of my projects tended to be small, you know, vis-a-vis those of my fellow curators with budgets not allowing for growth. At times, my frustration was evident, but I did not want my personal feelings to get in the way. I felt I owed it to the artist and the museum to do the best I could for the opportunities handed to me. I am no longer interested in working full-time in a museum. Even more so now that the pandemic has uncovered profound institutional deficiencies, chief among them racial and economic imbalances, and the lack of empathy museum trustees and administrators have shown for their most vulnerable employees. COVID-19 is a wake-up call and an excellent opportunity for museums to embrace a new institutional self-consciousness to secure their survival. Urgent and global concerns such as climate change and racial inequality are highly apparent and should be addressed, but museums continue to hang on to antiquated traditions. A recent dispute about the question, what is a museum, during a recent meeting of the International Council of Museums made this evident. Some institutions see themselves as places that, and I quote, exhibit and research artifacts, while others want to, quote, engage actively with political and social issues. It is apt then that Holland Cotter, the New York Times art critic, wrote in a March 2020 article that museums, and I'm quoting here, need to acknowledge the often conflicted relationship between aesthetics and ethics. And I think this is something that we need to think about very seriously now. So to conclude, I know that our professionals are at a crossroad, given our current socio-political climate and the crisis brewing in the museum field. We have to determine whether we should continue to accept the status quo or fight for fundamental transformational changes that I believe in the end will benefit everyone. A new definition of what a museum is would help, but ICOM has been debating this issue since 2016 and has not been able to come up with an answer. So we are, in a difficult moment. Hopefully things will improve, but I think it's the time for reflection. And as I said before, it's museums have to do that. We do have to think about how to correct these inequalities within the institution. We tend to discuss social justice in the form of exhibitions, but all these wonderful things happen in the galleries, but they don't happen, within the museum. They don't happen with the museum staff. And I think that there's a kind of hypocrisy when there is a disconnect between the two. So I'm leaving you with those thoughts, and I'm ready for any questions that anyone can have.
Thank you so much, Alma. There is a 20-second or so delay between our live stream here and YouTube. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a question from one of our funding sources. Many of the exhibitions you spoke about are interactive. Can you go into more detail about how embodiment is an important part of participatory art?
Yes, it's the Julio Clarke, one of the artists that I showed, was when he moved to France, he created a group with some French artists to work on exhibitions that did not happen in museums. Most of the work they did was on the streets of Paris. And the reason for that, and they wrote manifestos, and some of the manifestos were quite political. And he believed that making art was not just creating something and then presenting it to an audience. He felt that you had to look at art as a triangle that was composed by the artist, the viewer, and the art. And the art would never be completed if you didn't have a viewer who participated in the process. So I think that I like that idea. I like the idea of not passive contemplation, but active participation. And many of my exhibitions show that. So people came to the museum, but they didn't have to be reverent about it. They didn't have to be quiet many times. They could bring their family and have a good time. They could enjoy the exhibition together. And some of those exhibitions were really very popular for that reason. You could come with your friends and have a good time. So the idea of, museums can be many things to many people, right? There were other exhibitions in which you certainly needed to respect, the museum protocols. You couldn't touch the art, you stay away from it, there is a certain separation between you and it. You have to be careful about it and so on. But for me, many ways of involving people, especially because not all our audiences are knowledgeable about it. Many museum visitors, even with the proliferation of contemporary art museums, still don't understand what contemporary art is. And I think that by providing this kind of participatory work, something they could hold in their hands, something they could step on or lie on top of it or move around, was an entry that we could use to then, share the artist's practice, the artist's philosophy with them. So it was like a door. In a way, I saw it as a door, a way of entry. And once you were inside, then we could work on you and convince you that what the artist was doing was really amazing.
Thank you. Can you talk about the impact of the experimental exercise of freedom, or Zoko survey, on artists in LA? Was the quote social turn, unquote, or end quote, of the early 2000s, informed by LA artists' encounter with these shows?
Well, interesting enough, these artists were very well known in their respective countries. They, 3 of them had moved from Europe to South America and Mexico. 2 of them were born in South America, but had lived in Europe as well. They were very connected to Europe in a way. And they were very well known in their country. There had been exhibitions of their work, even retrospectives. They were widely collected by private collectors, public institutions. There were books written about them. They were revered, in their countries, but for some reason they were not known in the United States. Maybe the reason in a way, and there are reasons for that, and the reasons tend to be political. On one hand, a lot of artists in Latin America up until recently come from the middle class and from the upper class, which means that they're more European to a certain extent. So many of them still had family in Europe, so they kept that connection, or many of them were able to study in Europe, so they created relationships that they kept throughout their careers. And their connection was to Europe, not to the United States. They didn't see the United States as the good guy. Artists tended to be, to lean towards the left. Intellectuals in Latin America usually lean towards the left. That's a known fact. Artists were the same. So if artists wanted to have a dialogue with philosophers, with writers, with poets, they couldn't be on the right. They couldn't have opposing views. And so their view was not set on the United States. It was set on Europe, until very recently with the advent of, the internet, things have changed. For the most part, artists would learn French as opposed to learning English. Now all the young artists, speak English, and they look at the United States and they have more communication with the United States. But at the time, that generation did not. It was very different. And so they were not known here. So that was another idea that I always had in mind. Bring artists who are not known. Bring new artists, present artists that will give you something new. And we thought about local artists as well. The museum has always been a very artist-centric and always considered the local art scene as its main audience, actually. And so we were thinking about that. And so I think that even though when you create an exhibition, you don't always know how that exhibition has affected other people, eventually someone will tell you something about it. You run into an artist who will, say something, and then that's the way you find out. But I think that I think it caused an impression on the local artists. I know that, for example, at CalArts, some women artists picked up on Leja Clarke's work very quickly, and they incorporated that work into her classes. I know, for example, that Katha Paquette at Long Beach, who became a wonderful colleague. She came to me and asked me for materials about the artists, and I provided it to her for her classes. And I think that she embraced those artists wonderfully and taught them at the school. And I know that other people did as well. So I don't exactly know how this exhibition could have influenced people, but I think that, but it did in some ways. And also, interesting, for example, Mira Schendel, she was born in Switzerland. Her mother was a Jew, but she was married to an Italian aristocrat. So she was protected during World War II, but Mira Schendel wasn't. So she was living in Italy, and then she had to travel to Yugoslavia to get a visa and then go to Brazil. This was late in the war, but she spent many years in Yugoslavia waiting for her visa and waiting for a place where she could actually go. After the exhibition at MoCA, somehow the Swiss began to realize that they had these artists who had been born in Switzerland and that they needed to look at. And so exhibitions happened in Switzerland of Mira Schendel's work. And so I think that, and of course, Oiticica as well. I think he became, and Leja Clarke became better known in the US, and MoMA did a Clarke exhibition. Many years later, although they focused more on the early work, the more modern work, painting and sculpture, as opposed to what we had presented at MoCA. So I think that there are many ways in which these exhibitions can, and I was very happy that that was happening. I mean, there are many artists who would come and have told me they always came to see my shows because they would see something different. And I was very pleased with that. Yeah.
Thank you. Next, what do you think the role of the curator is outside the museum, and how can curators work outside the museum structure?
Well, what do you, I need some clarification. Outside the museum, you mean a museum curator working outside or an independent curator working on his or her own without institutional backing?
This is a question coming from one of our attendees. So they can offer clarification, but in real time, if I'm to perceive this, I'm going to say the curator who is institutionally cited, what is their role outside of the museum?
Mm-hmm.
And how can they work out? I guess it's actually kind of both now that I'm reading it in that light.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the role of an institutionally cited and an independent curator outside of the museum?
Well, okay, this is my opinion. You know, other colleagues may think it differently, but for me, as a curator, I always consider myself a public figure, someone who had to be inside and outside of the institution. So I didn't wall myself up. You know, I was accessible. You know, of course, that takes it takes more work. You know, but I was accessible. People would call me, and they could approach me for a studio visit, and I would do that. Unless I really felt that the work was not such that the museum would ever be interested in. So of course, and to manage my time, I also had to parse myself. But I was very available for studio visits. I went to galleries all the time. I thought that it was important that galleries felt that museum curators were actually were following their program, you know, and I spoke to them. I went to openings at the beginning. I went to a lot of openings, but they take so much of your time that I ended up towards the end not going to many openings, but trying to see the exhibitions on weekends or on weekdays where I could see 5-6 shows in a day. So it's a matter of managing my time in a way that I would avoid some openings, although it was a wonderful time to network, you know. But I always felt that I was a public figure and that I could not respond to the local art scene, to the artists, to the galleries, and of course to other museums. And I, you know, I knew my colleagues in the other museums. I went to their exhibitions or to their openings if I was invited, and I tried to maintain a collegial relationship with them. So because I was, and I was always conscious that I was representing MoCA, you know, that I needed to have that in mind all the time. So I couldn't promise things, you know, MoCA wouldn't deliver. I couldn't say things that perhaps would be counter to MoCA's philosophy or things of that sort. So I was always very aware that I represented the museum in everything I did when I was introduced as a MoCA curator, you know. Now, the independent curator, in a way, that's kind of a new situation in the United States to a certain extent. When I started at the museum, I don't remember many independent curators. I think they were just beginning to be. Most curators were affiliated with an institution. To do certain projects, you need the institution backing. So in the United States, you know, being able to work for an institution because these institutions have more stability, it was always a plus. You know, it was much better for you to be a museum curator than to be an independent curator. Things have changed, and you know, the idea of being independent today is much more accepted. And even many museums work with independent curators. They may have one curator on staff, and then, you know, the rest are independent or guest curators. And it gives, you know, in some ways it's great because it gives the institution, you know, a diversity of voices, ideas. You also increase your network by working with guest curators and so on. So it has its advantages and disadvantages, but institutions like MoCA or LACMA You know, all of these well-known museums have their own curatorial staff, and they will not work with independent curators unless those curators are invited by the institution to collaborate on a project. So for someone to come with an idea to MoCA and say, I would like to do this exhibition here, that, at least when I was there, that was basically impossible, you know, unless that person came and said, would you like to collaborate? And because there needed to be some supervision on the part of the institution, there was always a curator who worked with, there was always a MoCA curator involved in every exhibition the museum had, whether it was a MoCA organized or whether the exhibition came from other institutions, because you need the supervision. You know, you can't let someone just run loose, you know, because you have budgets to watch for. You also want to facilitate that person's work within the exhibition, within the institution. Yeah, you know, and if that person has questions, you know whom to go to, you know how to get responses. You're a facilitator in that respect. So there's always that that part in which the museum has to maintain a certain control over its own programming and events. Yeah.
Thank you. I think based on time, this will be our last question. Unfortunately, we wish we could have you here all day, but you're being asked, excuse me. In your conclusion, you mentioned the need for a common understanding of what the museum is or what purpose the institution serves to its community. How do you think this definition or understanding should evolve?
Well, you know, I think that museums should serve the audiences. They should serve their audiences. So I think that museums need to serve the people around them. And I think that many institutions don't do that. They need to think about where they are located, you know, what their geographical location is, who is around them, who is their audience, and they need to then connect that to their program. I think museums cannot be fortresses anymore. I think they need to also mirror their audience inside the museum. You know, their employees should reflect the population of the city they are in. And this is not happening yet. This is not happening yet. And sometimes it may happen, but as you know, when you change your director, you change many things in the museum. And sometimes you have taken 2 steps forward and then a new director comes and then you take 3 steps backward, you know, and there's not much you can do because it's the director who's setting the tone, you know. And in some institutions, the chief curator, if you have one, have a lot of power as well. So it also, they're also crucial individuals within the institution, and they really need to be clear, you know, and as to what they want to do and whether that meshes with the museum's mission, but also with the people who are going to be coming to see your shows, because it's a conflict. Right nowadays, you know, many people go to museums and they can't identify themselves. They cannot see themselves within the institution. So that's something that we need to think about. And I think that museums may be a little afraid of change because museums are the keepers of tradition. But and boards are usually very homogeneous because that's where the wealth resides. So if a generational wealth can then be created for other people that can come in and be part of those boards, that may help. MoCA did 2 things that were did one thing that was very important. I think it was one of the first museums, if not the first, to incorporate artists into the board. You know, Robert Irwin and Sam Francis were the first 2 artists in the MoCA board. Robert Irwin was the first. Maybe he he became a trustee in early 1980, and then by September, Sam was there as well. And the reason for bringing them was to sort of help in the dialogue with a lot of all these other trustees who were mostly businessmen and who didn't really know how museums function. So the idea was that the artists could shed light on what the museum's mission was. And another thing that MoCA did too is that it invited a small group of international collectors to join the board early on. And these were people who had been collecting for a while, who had a different sense of philanthropy, maybe old-fashioned philanthropy compared to today, and that they could serve as examples and inspiration to the trustees. And so Dominique de Menil was one of the trustees, Count Giuseppe Panza was another one, Peter Ludwig, whose name is on the Ludwig Museum in Cologne was another one. Seiji Tsutsumi from Japan was another international collector. So it was quite an international board, and it helped a lot. It inspired some of the trustees on the MoCA board to, in quote, do the right thing. So I think that that's important. That is really important. And beginning with the board and the staff, and then moving on to the museum program. I think that's the way museums are going to be successful in the future.
Thank you so much, Alma, for your time, your insight, and everything that you've been willing to share with us today. It's absolutely incredible to have you here.
Thank you very much.
So also to all of our attendees, my apologies for any technical difficulties. We do have this recorded. I know many of you are here via our YouTube live stream. The entirety of this session will be online by tonight on our website, as well as through the rest of the year, and hopefully for quite some time if you ever want to return to it or see it in its entirety. Thank you for being here. Today's talk is part of a series of lectures and panels that will be continuing into next week. On Monday, we'll be hearing a discussion between Lauren Woods and Kimberly Meyer, moderated by a recent CSULB graduate student, Andrea Guerrero. And then Monday evening, we'll hear from Edgar Hipa Birds on his art and practice, and conclude with a symposium on Wednesday, or excuse me, with a panel on Wednesday with a conversation between Latanya Autry, Aruna D'Souza, Helen Molesworth, and Laura Reikovic. This will be moderated by Nizan Shaked. For the schedule and full information regarding registration, visit our website, as well as reaching out to us directly through email if you have questions. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Alma. This was incredible. I guess we're still recording. So I'll catch you later.